Karen Talameli, Executive Vice President of ImpactWayv, and welcome to the latest in the ImpactWayv podcast series. ImpactWayv was designed to be a healthier and more meaningful alternative to existing social media. Its function is to unite people, business, and nonprofits to accelerate the collective impact on global social media platforms. And today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Gerald Torres. Gerald is a professor at the Yale School of the Environment, Yale Law School, and also the Yale Center for Environmental Justice. Gerald is a pioneer in the field of environmental law. Professor Torres spent his career examining the intrinsic connections between the environment, agricultural and food systems, and social justice. His research into how race and ethnicity impact environmental policy has been influential in the emergence and evolution of the field of environmental justice. Professor Torres' has also worked includes the study of conflicts over resource management between Native American tribes, states, and federal government. And welcome, Professor Torres. Thank you for joining me today as we talk about climate action and environmental justice, two topics intrinsically linked. So it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for having me. I look forward to the conversation. You know, one of the things that that has emerged, and you put your finger on it, is the link between how we address the climate crisis and the continuing effort to center concepts of justice in our environmental approach to solving the challenges facing us both domestically and internationally.
Well, thank you. No, we met when the Yale Center for Environmental Justice was being formed, the collaboration between the School of the Environment and the School of Law. And it's been wonderful to see a reality and such a successful inaugural year. Would you like to spend a
Sure. I mean, you know, when I joined the faculty here, one of the things they asked me to do was to start a center. And so I had a couple of goals initially. One is to try to make the Center for Environmental Justice essentially the hub that linked all the various kinds of research that's being done on environmental justice at Yale together to one. Two, to offer internships for students during the course of the year to work with local environmental groups and to convene those local environmental groups to listen to them so I could learn from them what their understanding of the environmental justice issues are. And the third is to provide career pathways for people to envision what a career in environmental justice would look like. And that meant connecting with the people who are actually doing the work out in the world. So we've tried to do all that as well as continue to initiate some research projects. So it's been a busy year, but I think it's been a successful launch.
Yeah, having participated in some of your conferences, I'd say so. It's been really busy. You know, congratulations. Look forward to next year.
Thank you.
You know, right now, the climate bill or proposed bill is dominating the news. Some say it won't solve the climate crisis, while others say it was significantly positive and will pour billions into the environmental justice space. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, certainly, you know, it is only a bill, right? And so we hope that we can, you know, get it past the finish line. But you know, I want to put the current bill in the context of the priorities of this administration when it entered, when it took control of the presidency and the current agencies. The first thing it did that was really important was it said that it would center the idea of justice in all of its environmental initiatives, which I think is an important step, and that it would take a whole government approach so that it's not just EPA, it's not just Interior, it's not just the Department of Energy, it's Department of Transportation, Department of Agriculture, all of the agencies that do things that have an effect on the environment would try to re-understand their programs, putting the idea of justice and equity first and centering it to ask the questions in advance. What are the equity impacts of these decisions? Now, the current bill, of course, is, everybody was pronouncing climate action dead on arrival. But of course, it's been revived, and it's been revived in the way that politics always does, which is through compromise. Is it the ideal bill? Absolutely not. But you know what? Everything starts with the first step. And this is an important first step. It does earmark a substantial number of dollars to the environmental justice initiatives. It does set new goals for energy. It does, look at, not as comprehensively, at all of the things that government does, especially in the context of reviving the economy and keeping the economy healthy. It looks at all of those, and it takes the Justice 40 approach, which was part of the initial proposal back in at the beginning of the administration, and incorporates some of those commitments and insights. So whether everything remains in the bill at the end is unclear, but I can say unequivocally that this is the most serious commitment, both climate action and environmental justice, that any administration has taken. And it's to be applauded. And I think the bipartisan nature of it is also really important.
Yeah, well, yes, it's refreshing and needed if we're going to get over the finish line there and make this critical next step. I've heard you say in the past that the justice lens is critical in addressing these climate issues, that the moral position multiplies your power.
Well, yes, I think, one of there are a couple of points. One is there's one of the things that environmental justice does is it asks a couple of questions. And for this current bill, it's actually going to continue to ask these questions. One, it asks the distributional question. That is, who is bearing the burden of the environmental consequences of our industrial society? And are those burdens equitably distributed? Have the questions that need to be asked right at the beginning been asked to ensure that the distributional effects are taken into account as the programs are both designed and as the programs are unfolded? So that's one part. The second part, of course, and we'll see this especially important in the clean energy transition, is who benefits from the upside of the transition. So where are the jobs going? What is the impact on the cost profile of energy to these various communities? Those underline two things. One, the continuing moral imperative of keeping justice at the center of the inquiry. But second, recognizing that there's many ways to understand how that justice focus will be interpreted. So you have the distributional focus, you have the procedural focus, you have the benefits focus. And all of those things they're built into the approach that the bill is taking, but they're built into the approach that the environmental justice advocates have been taking from almost from the very beginning.
Yes, and on that piece, it seems the climate action, is very much global as well as local, and people have the power to affect change, and oftentimes could do so more effectively than government. It appears that, like organizations, like even we talk YCEJ, get into the communities, and like you have, I think, said in your team, it's not telling people what they need. It's letting them tell you what they need, because the organizations have the tools to organize and to let the people know that, they do have power. It's in their hands. And it's a big difference when you're fighting for something or fighting against something. When you're fighting for your family, your home, your way of living, it is personal. And is this where some of these, some organizations can come in and really give these organizational tools to affect real climate change?
I mean, that's exactly right. One of the things that the Yale Center for the Environment wanted to do right at the beginning, and it was the first thing we did, and that was to reach out to both local and regional environmental justice groups, and to meet with them and to talk with them, and then to convene meetings where we brought activists from other areas together to help us understand the way they understand the environmental justice challenges in front of them, and to understand what they were doing in their local communities to mobilize to address them. And then the question for us was, how can we assist them in mobilizing the energy and the power that they already have to affect these changes? How can we, taking the various skills that we're going to bring, help them achieve some of the goals that they've already identified? So one of the things that I learned, many years ago, is that in the environmental justice space, is that things that if you restrict yourself to just the environmental statutes, the environmental justice statutes, the ones that we think of, the clean air, clean water, et cetera, incredibly important statutes. But they were created during a time when the issues that environmental justice advocates were raising weren't central. Mm-hmm. By centering them, we can point to the ways in which environmental statutes need to be modified or affected, but we also can see that other kinds of decisions, which maybe aren't thought of as environmental decisions, have an impact on the lived environment of these communities. And we have to ask, how can we intervene there to create a better environment? Let me just give you one example. Mm-hmm. Right now we're all experiencing, I'm sure you are, the hot summer. Well, the identification of hotspots is tied to heat islands, right? It's tied to various causes. But one thing we've identified is the prevalence of tree cover, green space, kind of greenness in the neighborhoods. Well, of course, the decisions that were made a generation ago are the decisions that are going to impact how these neighborhoods look now. But we can say one thing we ought to focus on is creating more green cover, green space, for a number of reasons. One is we find that the more green cover you have, the cooler neighborhoods are. We've also discovered that the more green cover you have, the lower the incidence of asthma, because it has an impact on particulate matter. But the other thing we've found is it reduces the stress in neighborhoods. And so it has, profound mental health benefits as well. All of those, you wouldn't think of a mental health benefit as being an environmental justice benefit, but of course it is, right? Because it's about how we live in the world and what we can do to make, to change or affect the environment to reduce the burdens of our modern urban, industrial, and rural life. So, by taking justice, you can expand beyond the environmental statutes, the way we normally think of the environment, and ask broader questions. Listening to the groups, as you pointed out, is really critical, because they're going to tell you the way they experience their environment. And then you've got to take that seriously and think about it and ask, okay, what can we do? How can we help?
Yeah, and I was this whole conversation, and we discussed this on a previous podcast with Doug Woodring, by creating initiatives that directly impact these communities and getting the stakeholders involved. He's talking about in Cambodia, getting the monks involved. If you don't have the monks involved, but all the trash that is coming in from these communities to the ocean has a dramatic effect on the quality of life. And it's not looked at in the global, as climate action or environmental justice, when, almost everything is getting down to an environmental justice and a social justice issue. But it's the local communities. When you take away government and eliminate bans and taxes and legislation, you could get things done.
Well, let me take the point you made and add one more element that I think is really critical. That is, if we're thinking about how to make democracy more effective, that is, for the people's voice to actually be heard, one of the things you've got to do is you've got to take that seriously. And so listening to environmental justice groups means that you are creating another potential venue for citizen participation, and to include the broader community. So you mentioned, in Cambodia, the monks were critical. Well, in fact, one of the things we've discovered is various aspects of the community. So the faith community is an important element in the environmental justice movement. It incredibly important in many community groups. So that making participation both meaningful and accessible is part of achieving environmental justice goals.
Yes, and that tied right in. I was thinking of this Cambodia effort, and then even Next Gen in Oxnard, California. That group just had a dramatic effect affecting their. I think that this. I was thinking about this other issue that probably affects people, but the extreme weather is having devastating effects, and in addition to disproportionately affecting vulnerable communities, it's having a damaging effect on crops and livestock. I mean, it was just amazing to hear that hundreds of livestock were buried because they died from the heat. So do you think people are getting a bit desensitized looking at this issue on a global level and not seeing or realizing the effects it even has on, our local food chain and then even the prices of food?
Well, I mean, I think it's actually just the opposite.
Okay.
I think the people recognize it as a global problem, and if you think of it just as a global problem, your capacity to imagine your ability to affect change is diminished. It's the problem's too big. I can't manage this. I'm just one person. I'm just one small group. How do I affect the big decisions that have to get made to combat climate change? But in fact, the point you made, which is that the impact of climate change, let's take agriculture, for example, can be felt in many ways. One, for the actual producers who are out there, the impact on crop production, not to mention livestock, we'll put livestock to one side for a minute, but the impact on crop production means that they're going to have more crop failures. The rain will come at the wrong time, right? You all need rain, but it needs to come at the right time. There will be droughts, which we've been experiencing. That's going to have an impact on the downstream costs, right? So what's happening in the Farm Belt is going to be felt in the supermarket. And so when you go to buy, I mean, I suppose I should admit this, I love barbecue. Right? But as I read the stories of my favorite barbecue places down in Texas, they've had to make one of two choices: raise the price of brisket, right, or sell smaller portions. Neither of which makes their customers happy, right? So their customers are being made to understand the price profile these producers are facing, largely because of things like drought, things like access to feed, increased feed prices, the reduction in cropland production. So and they affect everyone day to day. Now, right, the person says, okay, maybe I can't affect the changes that need to get made by the global actors, but I can raise the question of the availability of nutritious food and the price of it in my local community, and raise that as an issue, and then point to the justice impacts of that. We can point to things like food waste, for example. Right? And some communities have taken it into their own hands to address the question of food waste, which means that if we reduce the amount of food waste, we have the capacity to increase the amount of available nutritious food for communities. So there are many ways to get involved. And I think the fact that people experience it in real terms in their day-to-day life actually doesn't diminish the desire to become involved. In fact, amplifies it. And I think the amplification is where the potential for more democratic participation will arise. So
exactly, and that's what I was, is it the need for the education and the advocacy to basically connect those dots, that this global issue, and that's where I say, are you desensitized? And maybe that was the wrong term, because you're looking at it so global, you're not realizing it impacts right in your home because of these. And this is where the education and the advocacy, and most especially from the environmental justice advocates, that climate action is right in your pantry.
Right. No, exactly. And I mean, the point you made is really critical, right? That the education that's going on, right, is the connecting the dots, right? How is what I'm experiencing in my day-to-day life connected to these big decisions, and where can I intervene in the world which I occupy to have an impact, or certainly at minimum to raise it as an expression of the issue of climate in my local community. So, I mean, I think that's, I think you hit the nail on the head, that education towards connecting the dots, as you put it, is really critical.
Well, a lot of times, because of what we do at Impact, we talk about, companies and ESG and CSR. And when I hear about greenwashing, it often relates to reporting and compliance. But there is a more serious greenwashing that has a direct impact on climate and environmental justice. Can you speak to the process of chemical recycling and its effects on climate and the direct impact on communities?
I'm not exactly sure what you mean by chemical recycling, but
the incineration of plastics that is, called manufacturing, when it's, well, I guess I can say instead of incinerating, taking out, calling it so-called recycling when it's not recycling. It's putting toxics in and creating, just not another use for that plastic.
No, I look. I think you're exactly right. One of the things that we have to be concerned about is whether an approach to resolving one problem creates another, right? And whether the compromises that get made in order to push policy forward, in fact, have unintended consequences. So let me give you an example. The coal scrubbing, right, which was the technology for making coal a cleaner fuel. What that ended up producing ended up transforming a kind of an air pollution and converted it to a solid waste problem. So you have the residue of those processes then become a toxin that has to be dealt with. There is some effort to think about incineration as a way to get rid of trash and convert it to energy. You've got to be skeptical that the other consequences of, say, and here you pointed directly to air pollution implications. You've got to be careful when those proposals are made to ask what the downstream effects are, and not to assume that merely because it's reducing the volume of waste, you've somehow solved a big problem. Because you've got to make sure you don't create a new problem with the solution that you're adopting for the problem right in front of you.
Yeah, and then you get into, it seems like many of the communities that these facilities are going in, that it should be a little skeptical just by the nature of what we do, are almost targeting of sorts the low income neighborhoods and the communities that are the most vulnerable and have the least amount of resources to fight for themselves.
Well, that impact, right, is essential. It highlights why the consideration of the justice implications of the regulation that you're adopting or the process that you're permitting, why that has to be taken into account at the beginning, right? So that if you don't ask the right questions at the beginning, you're not going to get the right answers. There was a study that had as its hypothesis that people with complicated health problems will spend more money on healthcare, so that if you could identify what those complicated health problems are, you could treat them in advance and reduce the cost of healthcare. Well, seems like a completely valid insight. The problem is, it's only people who have the resources to go to doctors to get these conditions dealt with that spend the money. So you identify the wrong communities that you've got to be intervening in. And there, in perfectly good faith, it's the wrong question that was asked and led to a wrong analysis of what the problem was. So you've got to ask yourself at every step. Now, I'm not counseling inaction or paralysis, but you do have to ask yourself, what am I missing? What am I missing? Okay, who do I need to ask to inform my own perspective and analysis? So you mentioned ESG. What ESG is really about is it's an accounting metric, certainly, right? But it's also asking, what questions should I be concerned with? And that's a critical. We all need to make that inquiry, right? What questions do I need to be concerned with? Who should I try to bring into the conversation to make sure that I'm not leaving something out? You may ultimately bring something into the conversation, decide that it's not exactly apropos, but it's still important. I was talking to a friend who said that the way that she was evaluating the processes of her business was to talk to the auditor, because the auditor said, what questions should I ask about this business? Right. And that led me to think, well, that's exactly right. The auditor will measure what you ask him to measure. Right. And so one of the questions that ESG poses, for example, is what should we be measuring, and how should that determine which questions we ask? And that's what the commitment to environmental justice is about, which is, how should we assess the success of these environmental programs? Climate is another one, right? Because the one thing that when you ask how are we going to mitigate or ameliorate the impacts, first question you have to ask is, for whom and how, right? And the second question you need to ask is, are we thinking about this in the right way? Let me give you an example. The coastal indigenous communities in Alaska who are at risk to losing some of their ancestral lands to sea level rise, for example, have asked to consider the loss to the community as a whole, not just to individual members of the community, because the thing of value is not just the land. The land's obviously critical, but it's the what the land did was to create the capacity for this community to continue to exist. So if the community can't exist, they're losing not just the physical land, they're losing the social cohesion that helped identify who they are. And we need to start thinking about whether there are community interests. So when we think about ameliorating the impacts of climate change or adapting to climate change, we have to ask, are we thinking at the right scale? Are we thinking of individual losses? Are we thinking about community losses? How do we assess community losses? How do we define community? So questions like that are critical as well. So I think you're right.
It is critical, and I think you're right. We've identified this, having gone through so many audits. I remember years ago when, really dating myself, when, IT and all the computers, that ended up being a critical part of your auditing. What are you doing? What is your risk management? And this is where you're absolutely right. Who knows better in risk management? Because it is good management. It should not be viewed just as a compliance box to be checked off. Because done right, it's very profitable. It is a good thing, and it has financial advantages. But going to a global conference on this, it is interesting to hear these world leaders and corporate leaders struggle and say, we get the E and the G. So they know government and environment you could try. They struggle with the S. And it's like, do you just look in the communities that you're working with? Talk to the people. What better way could you have to get support from the people to actually care about the community and talk to the community?
Right. No, I think you're right. I mean,
for the job.
I mean, it's funny because to take us outside of the field of environmental law for a minute. One of the conversations that's happening in corporate law, certainly in corporate law scholarship, right, is whether the primacy of shareholder value, which is, of course, has been dominated the way we've been thinking about this, is in fact too narrow a conception of who has a stake in the enterprise, right? So the question of who the stakeholders are becomes a slightly different question, right? You have employees, you have the community, you have the shareholders, you have the managers, right? All of these people have stakes in the enterprise. How do you measure the impact? How do you take account of what those stakes are? And certainly when you then put environment on top of that, it means what are the environmental consequences to certain of the stakeholders as against other of the stakeholders, and how do you then factor those issues together to answer the questions that are necessarily asked by ESG?
Totally agree. Thank you. And Professor, I want to thank you. Before we close it, I'd love you to talk more about what's going on at the YCEJ. You've got a lot of things coming up.
Mm-hmm. Well, yes, we in fact this October, and I encourage anyone who's watching this or anyone who you reach out to join us at our annual Global Environmental Conference. The Global Environmental Justice Conference is going to be October 13th and 14th. Climate justice, food security, energy transition, all of these issues are going to be addressed. It truly is a global conference. Last year, we had 60 representatives from 60 countries represented at the conference. The outreach, the number of people who tune in virtually, since it's going to be a hybrid conference, it'll be live, but also virtual, is global. And so I encourage people to come and and participate in that. So we're going to be doing that. That's an annual event, one of our important events. We're also creating a number of internships for students to do work with groups. The other thing we're going to be doing this year is we're having a conference on co-management between tribal nations, government, and private managers of natural resources. And so we're going to be having the leaders engage in a workshop one day, talking about the issues in co-management. And then the next day we'll have a public conference. And we haven't nailed down the dates yet, but the working dates right now are November 4th and 5th. And so I encourage people who are interested in co-management of natural resources and the role of indigenous people and tribal nations to join us for that as well. You can certainly go to the website for the Yale Center of Environmental Justice to find out more, or if you want to get in touch with me, that's the easiest way to get in touch with me. So thank you.
And thank you. And for more information, the Yale Center for Environmental Justice is on ImpactWayv, and we always have your updates there as well. So,
great, thank you.
Professor Torres, I thank you so much for spending some time with me today. Thanks everyone for tuning in. If you enjoyed this conversation, please give us a like and download our ImpactWayv app to continue the conversation. I hope to see you again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.